On March 29th, 1889, a domestic dispute turned deadly. 29-year-old William Kemmler, a petty vegetable peddler in Buffalo, New York, was recovering from a drunken binge when he began arguing with his girlfriend, Tilly Ziegler, whom he suspected of cheating. The argument turned to a shouting match. Kemmler grabbed a hatchet from his barn and hacked Tilly Ziegler to death. Next, he sauntered over to his neighbor's house and confessed the crime. "I get the rope for this," he was reported to have said. How wrong he was. Kemmler's trial proceeded quickly. A jury of his peers sentenced him to death, but not by hanging. Earlier that year, an act of the New York State Legislature had taken effect, advancing a new form of execution. Kemmler was the first man to be killed by electricity. As of yet, no experiment in killing humans by electricity had been carried out. Kemmler would be a guinea pig. Everyone knew electricity had the power to kill, but could it be harnessed to kill? What would such a death look like? This is the story of one of the world's most notorious killing machines. It's the shocking origins of the electric chair. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel, and be aware that this episode is going to be a little more gruesome and morbid than my other episodes on presidents, so proceed with caution. You might just want to check out one of my other 80+ videos instead. But for those of you who are still here, let's get going. Death by electricity was yet an untested form of execution, and condemned killer William Kemmler hoped safety concerns would justify a stay of his execution. In May of 1889, his lawyer managed to secure an appeal determining whether electricity could safely and humanely kill a person. Kemmler, an illiterate alcoholic vegetable peddler, had no special connections of his own, yet his case was taken up by a top New York attorney, and all fees were covered by George Westinghouse, one of the world's most powerful electricity magnates. Why would Westinghouse bankroll the defense of a random guy who'd murdered his wife in cold blood? The electric chair, which was to be used to kill Mr. Kemmler, ran on a Westinghouse AC generator. AC stands for alternating current, one of two ways to provide electricity to a device. The other way was called direct current, or DC. So there's AC and there's DC, just like the band. I'm not an expert on electricity, and I've provided some sources in the description below which help explain the difference between these two systems of electricity, but frankly, I don't fully understand it. I can tell you that direct current, or DC, runs directly from a generator to a device, while alternating current runs in a loop back and forth between the device and the power generator. DC is great for power storage, whereas AC is better for providing power across long distances and more cheaply. And that's about all I know. What I do know is that in the late 1800s, there was a fierce competition between proponents of alternating current and proponents of direct current as the best system for providing electricity to the masses. Both sides were ruthless in their denunciations of the other, and both went to great and often absurd lengths to prove their supremacy over the other. With electricity only just emerging as a technology, many consumers worried about the risks of hundreds of electric volts pulsating through their homes and cities. Proponents of direct current took great care to assure customers that DC electricity was safe and that their competitor systems, the AC system, was dangerous, even deadly. If the electric chair were to be run on AC, it would be a huge propaganda win for DC in the fight over which current was more fatal to human life. George Westinghouse couldn't just let that happen. This appeal was his last chance. Expert witnesses from both sides of the question gave testimony in court that day, including the electric wizard of Menlo Park himself, Thomas Alva Edison. Edison was already world famous for inventing the phonograph and the light bulb, and for building great electrical grids and generators around the country, including on Wall Street in New York City, all running on direct power, or DC. Edison assured the court that electricity could provide a safe and effective means of executing criminals. Death would be quick and painless. He had seen the results himself in tests performed on animals at his labs. By now, the public had already heard about Edison's controversial animal experiments, but much was chalked up to the quirkiness of an idiosyncratic genius at work, the man who brought us the light bulb, the literal representation of an idea. Inventive as Edison was, the animal experiments he referenced in court that day were not his idea. That distinction belonged to Harold P. Brown, who also testified in court that day. Harold Brown was a DC fanatic, and like Edison, he dreamed of a world without alternating current. He hoped the association of Westinghouse and his AC system with the electric chair of death would frighten people away from ever adopting an AC system in their homes. Although Brown's work helped Edison defeat competitors, he wasn't actually working for Edison in any official capacity. Edison kept Brown at arm's length, but he couldn't deny the man's passion was helping the cause. Edison had first encountered Brown when he hired him as a salesman of one of his own inventions, the electric pen. Brown eventually quit and tried to strike it big as an inventor in his own right, but by that time, patents on electrical equipment were hard to come by. Edison himself had hundreds of patents. With little room to maneuver, Brown moved into an entirely different and emerging field, electrical engineering. An electrical engineer at this time didn't have to have any specific qualifications. Brown's years as an electric pen salesman and his own tinkering with electricity in his garage were qualification enough. At this time, the nature of electricity was extremely poorly understood. Edison himself had developed most of his inventions not through scientific method or abstract thinking, but through endless trial and error. He often exaggerated his findings and overpromised in sensational publicity stunts in order to drum up excitement and attract investors. What electricity really was, what its substance was, Edison had little idea. As it turned out, electricity's nature was very unpredictable. It was unexplored territory, both scientifically and business-wise. Electricity offered a field for advancement where tradition and guilds had yet to plant their flags, a perfect place where self-made men could be made. Anyone of any class with a bit of pluck and tenacity could strike it big and remake the world. One aspect of electricity's nature which everyone understood was its deadliness. It's known by any human who has been zapped by an electrical socket or who ever cowered in fear from lightning bolts. I've been shocked a few times. The charge grips you, causes your muscles to tighten. It can burn you, even kill you. Lightning was seen by primitive humans and even many civilized ones as death incarnate. For millennia, knowledge about this force was consigned to the gods. Then slowly, gradually, starting in the 18th century, electricity's power was harnessed and made available to people for their daily needs. But had electricity truly been tamed? Had it left its destructive nature behind when it entered civilization? Many families were still afraid of having 110 volts of direct current pulsating through their homes, surrounding their children. While Edison assured customers of the safety of his system, he took special care to point out the dangers of the competing AC system. Sure, George Westinghouse can hook you up for a fraction of the price, but your house will be a death trap. Edison even took to the pages of the press to amplify his criticisms of alternating power. And Harold Brown, too, made a name for himself, defending Edison's point of view in print. In one article, Brown blamed the accidental death of a pedestrian by electric shock on alternating current. It was this article which first caught Edison's attention. Edison never formally hired him, but he provided assistance for a series of speaking tours and eventually offered lab space for experimentation. Brown set about gathering data to prove that AC power was the deadliest of all currents. His methods were stomach-turning. Brown, like Edison, worked primarily through trial and error. But the experiments I'm about to tell you of were more of an exercise in trial and terror. As such, I strongly advise discretion before proceeding with the next part of this video. In July of 1888, word went out in the neighborhoods around Pearl Street, New York, that Edison Labs were paying 25 cents for every stray dog who was brought to their door. Neighborhood children worked overtime to supply the labs with living specimens. In the dark recesses of Edison's laboratory, Brown had set up portable generators with 2 wires sticking out of each. A dog was brought in, and the wires attached to its hind legs. From here, Brown administered a series of shocks to each dog at varying voltages. Some dogs were killed instantly. Others survived multiple exposures. All of the over 40 dogs used in Brown's experiments were tortured by the experience, and only a handful survived. Thomas Edison appeared at many of these gruesome demonstrations. As a young man, he had experimented with electricity as a means of killing animals himself. While working for a railroad company, Edison built a device called the rat paralyzer, a metal plate attached to a small generator. When a rat would step on the plate with 2 feet, completing a circuit, a violent spark would fly out of the rat, accompanied by a loud pop. The rat was dead. Now, Brown's dog-killing trials were proving what Edison hoped. Alternating current was more deadly at lower voltages than direct current was. At least, that's what the data from Brown's experiments said. The public, and especially advocates of alternating current power, were far from convinced. And so, Harold Brown organized a demonstration. He gathered electricians, AC power advocates, and members of the press into a public assembly hall. As the house lights came down, Brown and his assistant entered the stage with a 76-pound Newfoundland dog. They placed the dog in a metal cage, tied him down, and muzzled him. Then, Brown proceeded to subject the dog to a series of direct current shocks of ever-increasing voltage. First 200, then 300, eventually 1,000. The dog cried in agony, and spectators winced, but he was still alive. Finally, Brown attached new wires to the dog, which were connected to a Westinghouse AC power generator. 1 shock of 300 volts, and the dog was dead. Brown believed he had proven his point beyond all doubt, but in reality, all he had done was expose the pseudoscience of his methods. Some in the audience began to cry foul. After all, the dog had already been severely weakened by the direct current shocks he received before the final alternating current shock, which ultimately killed him, was applied. In fact, this was Brown's preferred method for manufacturing data that made AC look deadly. He would usually shock dogs with DC to the edge of death, then deliver a low-voltage shock of AC to finish it off, apparently proving the unique deadliness of AC. Brown's meeting was eventually broken up by the SPCA, but before the crowds left the assembly hall, one audience member challenged Brown to an electrocution duel, in which he and Brown would be exposed to nasty shocks by their preferred current. If Brown was so confident about the safety of DC power, he should try it on himself. Brown declined. Such public embarrassment should have ended Brown's experiments right then and there, but Edison continued to bankroll Brown's research. There were higher interests at stake. In 1886, the New York State Legislature had commissioned an investigation into devising more humane ways of conducting criminal executions. At the time, hanging was the preferred method, but one that proved to be unreliable. Victims often died with great struggle, and sometimes decapitated themselves under their own weight. The commission recommended the state discontinue hangings and replace it with death by electricity. On June 4, 1888, the state passed a law making death by electricity the official new form of execution. The electric chair itself had not yet been invented. That's right, the state passed the law before the technology even existed. Edison and Brown quickly saw an opportunity to permanently fix the name of Westinghouse and his alternating current system to the new killing machine. Brown doubled his animal killing efforts, taking on larger and heavier animals, including different types of cows, and on one occasion, a horse, which Brown killed in Edison's presence. A new committee was convened in the New York legislature, and under the insistence of Brown and Edison, approved the construction of an electric chair. The condemned was to be strapped to the chair, and 2 metal nodes were to be placed on the neck and head, wrapped in wet sponges. 3,000 volts of alternating current was to pass through the condemned person's body for 15 to 30 seconds, over and over again, until they died. Best of all, the current would flow from a Westinghouse AC generator. During a press conference, Edison was asked about a rumor that his technology was being used to execute criminals. Edison smiled and answered, "Oh, those were Westinghouse's engines, not mine." George Westinghouse did his best to stop William Kemmler's execution, but the judge ultimately denied the appeal, setting an execution date of August 6, 1890. A small crowd of scientists, reporters, and the victim's family came to view the world's first execution by electricity. Kemmler was placed in the chair and strapped in. After speaking a few last words, a current of 1,700 volts of electricity was pumped into his body for 17 seconds. Kemmler stiffened until the current stopped, then slumped in his chair. A doctor at the scene pronounced him dead. Then suddenly, Kemmler let out a horrible groan. Someone from the crowd shouted, "He's still alive!" More electricity was sent into his body. Kemmler began to sweat blood from his face as the electricity started to cook his body. Viewers were repulsed by the horrible stench of burning flesh as Kemmler continued to be electrocuted. Finally, the current was released, and Kemmler was pronounced dead again. The scene was gruesome. George Westinghouse was one of the first to speak to reporters, calling it a brutal affair and suggesting the executioners use an axe next time instead. Brown and Edison, for their part, insisted that Kemmler had died instantly and that guards had unnecessarily continued to shock him after he died. Despite the botched first execution, Edison and Brown were pleased with the results. High on his own pride, Edison even suggested a new verb for execution by electricity, getting Westinghoused. The name didn't stick. Cooked, fried, zapped, baked, riding the lightning, sure, but not Westinghoused. Despite a few bumps, New York was satisfied with the first execution by electricity, and soon adopted the electric chair as its chief form of execution. In time, other states followed suit. For over 72 years, New York State executed nearly 700 criminals by electricity until the advent of lethal injection. The stigma Brown and Edison hoped the electric chair would attach to the Westinghouse name never stuck. Alternating current was simply too useful of a technology to be ignored. At the 1893 World's Fair, a Serbian inventor named Nikola Tesla put to rest all fears by running 200,000 volts of alternating current into his body. By placing the current at the highest possible frequency, he dulled its effect. The electricity merely ran across his skin without entering his body. The electric chair proved only one battle in a much longer war between alternating current and direct current, which continued well into the 20th century. It was a war with ultimately no real winner. Today, we live in a hybrid system. Many of our electronics, like iPhones and other battery-powered devices, run on direct current, whereas our homes are wired up using alternating current. The AC-DC wars were a brutal affair with no dearth of victims, both human and animal. They reveal to us the true nature of what it meant to be a self-made inventor in the early age of electricity, when the line between scientist and wizard, between scholar and charlatan, was as thin as the copper wires which carried this mysterious substance to the masses. Thomas Edison got one more chance to prove to the world the deadliness of alternating current when in 1903 he was tasked with the execution of a massive circus elephant named Topsy. Topsy was an aggressive elephant, She killed 2 trainers by crushing them to death under her massive weight. And another trainer, she lifted into the air with her trunk and smashed onto the ground during a performance, killing him as well. With such a murderous past, Topsy was sentenced to death by electrocution, and Edison was called in to do the job. On January 4th, 1903, Edison and his technicians arrived at the circus and attached large nodes to the elephant's hind legs. The nodes were hooked to wires, which were attached to a large generator. Topsy was fed 2 carrots, laced with 460 grains of cyanide. Then, Edison's machine sent over 6,000 volts of alternating current, of course, into Topsy, killing her within 10 seconds. The event was captured on another new form of technology, the motion picture camera. Though I won't show you that moment here. If you're that curious, you can look it up yourself on YouTube. Alright, that brings us to the end. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and have a great day.